Great, okay. Well, it's always nice to see a full room. Thank you very much for all of you for coming on time. Thanks to all the panellists also. My name's Damian Carrington, I'm a journalist at The Guardian. And welcome to this Policy Exchange event. So the title of the event is Will a Price Freeze Destroy the Energy Market? Of course that refers to last year's party conference when I was in Brighton, and I thought about not saying this actually, but that price freeze did electrify the party conference season. And now we are only 8 months or so from an election when it might come into play, so the rubber's hitting the road, as one might say. So we're here to debate what effect that price freeze will have on the market. Obviously there are other policies which Caroline will naturally explain better than me, but particularly interested in the energy efficiency, 5 million homes, 1 million interest-free loans for energy efficiency. Also the changes to regulator, which we talked about before, but again that's coming rather closer, and of course we have the Competition and Markets Authority inquiry going on at the same time, and it's interesting to see how those two sort of reflect off each other and how that's going to work. So we'll start with some words from each of our speakers in turn for about 5 minutes, and then we shall take questions. So if you want to start, Caroline, that'd be fantastic.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, it was interesting last year. I think I made my speech on the Tuesday morning, obviously knowing what Ed was going to say in the afternoon, and I was in a 3-hour lockdown before he made his speech. I think apart from electrifying the conference and really kept the debate going for the whole of the year, I think it was one of those rare things in politics. It came as a big surprise, which is good. But look, I mean, I remember sort of last year, you know, sort of some of the immediate voices that came out after Ed's speech was to say, you know, this is terrible, all the lights are going to go out, it'll never work, and what have you. And I hope that there is a sense that, you know, we very actively engage with lots of different organisations following Ed's announcement to explain not only the price freeze and why we thought it was important, and let me just recap on that. Our feeling, but also based on what we've looked at in terms of the data, is that actually the public haven't had a fair deal when it's come to sharing reductions in wholesale costs. And we were able to look back at information that is available from back in 2009 to indicate that when wholesale prices have fallen, we haven't seen a sort of sharing, if you like, of that cost reduction with customers. And so part of the price freeze is to give something back to the consumer, but also during the period of the price freeze to reset the energy market in a way that we can, I think, restore public confidence in this sector which is so important to so many people's lives. So around the price freeze, we announced a package of other policies which included separation of the generation supply side, similar to the way the networks are separated, that we want to have an electricity pool or power exchange where electricity can be traded openly and allow independent suppliers as well as independent generators more of a share into that market too. But also in terms of Ofgem, that we want a regulator that again can command public trust, but importantly have some additional powers. And those powers include that where wholesale costs fall, if the companies don't show how they're going to share that with their customers, then the regulator will have the power to force them to pass reductions on. And an announcement I made actually over the summer, which was to tackle a concern about the fact that despite a number of the companies having been fined for bad customer practices, there are still a number of investigations with some of these companies in terms of how they treat their customers. So we're going to give our new energy watchdog the power, if there are repeated, if you like, offences of poor customer practices, then the ultimate sanction, regardless if you've paid a fine in the past, you will lose your ability to supply energy. At the moment, Ofgem only has powers to do that, usually where a company goes into administration. So we think that's a strong deterrent in the system. And interestingly, we have the CMA review, looking at what they're going to examine. It chimes very well with some of our concerns, and we welcome it. And we see that we can work in parallel with the review. They are due to report, I think, around December 2015. They will obviously have points in that process where they'll be coming and asking for more evidence on different areas. If we win the general election next year, you know, we will take action on the price freeze, but meanwhile we will have our own white paper about our reforms, and we see that dovetailing very well with the CMA review. There may be things that the CMA will come up with that we haven't thought of, that we want to look at, but we are certainly on track for those package of reforms. And look, I'm not saying that, you know, the price freeze is popular in certain quarters in the sector, but, you know, actually I think some of the language and hostility has quietened down, but also I think our broader package of reforms have got quite a lot of support by different people in the sector in different ways. So I think we were knocking at the right door on that. Do you want me to say something about the energy efficiency, just briefly?
Yeah, if you could.
Okay. So on energy efficiency, people know, if they've followed what I've been saying in Parliament and elsewhere, that I haven't been happy about the way in which ECO was set up, but also the decision made by the government last year to change it, which seemed to me just to help out the big six in particular. And some of the things we raised at that time about how people would lose out, the loss of jobs, have become a reality. So one of the things we will be doing is looking at how we reshape the delivery of energy efficiency, but also the important question about how we use the money. I don't think it's right that of the money that is pulled together from ECO, nearly half of it doesn't go to the fuel poor. I want every single penny of that money to go to families in low incomes who are either in fuel poverty or in danger of falling into it. So that is a substantial change. We'll also be looking at setting higher standards for the private rented sector in terms of meeting a decency threshold. And on top of that, we'll be looking at trying to salvage the problem we've had with the Green Deal, which again, I have to say, is not necessarily a bad idea, but the execution of it has been pretty appalling. I think we've had something like only 2,000 households actually avail of them and get a job done under the Green Deal. So we will be, as part of an offer for those who can afford to pay something to make their homes more energy efficiency, 1 million interest-free loans over the course of the next Parliament. There's some other things as well, but that's just the sort of the headlines, if you like. And because I do recognise that the other part of making sure our bills are fair is recognising we pay more because often our homes are very leaky, and that's got to be the other side of this debate. And it's also why we'll be making energy efficiency a national infrastructure priority.
Thanks very much, Caroline. You said the debate's died down a bit over the price freeze. I'm sure we can raise it back up again. I hope the other speakers forgive me. I just wanted to clarify a couple of...
into submission.
Just to clarify a couple of things, so just for the benefit of the other speakers who've got to follow you. So on the price freeze, have you determined how you're going to set that price and when?
What we'll do is that we'll take immediate steps to have legislation which will give the Secretary of State the power to amend the licence to have the price freeze, and it will be a very small bill to get that done as sort of, almost like emergency legislation early on. So we're working on that at the moment. But it is a temporary price freeze. It's not about the sort of price controls we see in other parts of the European Union.
Okay, sure. So we won't see exactly how it's done until after the election, because you've got to, if you win, you have to get the bill through. Is that right?
Well, yeah, you do have to win the general election, have the numbers in the House of Commons, yes.
Okay, and the Competition and Markets Authority, you said, reporting in 2015. Does that mean your reforms to the regulator and other things are going to have to wait until that time?
No, I actually think it can work quite well. What we'll be issuing is probably a white paper pretty early on, and therefore that white paper, because obviously there are conventions about what you have to do before you create a draft bill, and the way I see it, we have the election, we get into the Parliament, get our white paper out, there'll be a proper consultation around that, and that should dovetail in quite nicely actually with the CMA coming back to report in the December. But I mean, it's not like the CMA are going into some sort of purdah, they are having discussions about the issues they're raising, and that, I think that's helpful to have that that process there.
Okay, and the very last thing, so when you say 1 million interest-free loans, this is to do with home efficiency for the people who can afford, is that essentially then a continuation of the Green Deal with a different financing mechanism?
I suppose, yeah, it is. I mean, one of our criticisms of the Green Deal is one, it's the interest rates are too high, but also I think sort of the delivery of it and if you like the marketing of it, as much as it hasn't been great, it's quite complicated as well in terms of just simplifying it. So the headline is about that, and but also we want to also look at how better we can actually make this something that people feel is a good deal rather than a dodgy deal. Okay,
brilliant. Thanks and apologies again to our panellists. So I'm going to turn to Peter Atherton next, who many of you will know is at Liberum Capital, an equity analyst, and started his career in the Central Electricity Generating Board. So he knows the industry inside out. So, were you one of the people who said the lights were going to go out?
Thanks, David. No, I didn't say the lights were going to go out. I did, however, say that I put every stock that I was covering that was impacted with the price freeze on a sell recommendation within an hour of the speech being made. Just for those who don't know,
it's probably gone up again now. That's the way these things.
The job of an equity analyst, for those who don't know what I do, I work for an investment bank. Liberum was one of the independent investment banks. And my job is basically to advise pension funds, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and people what to invest in. So I have very simple buy, sell, and hold recommendations on companies. Obviously, my clients may or may not follow my advice. And I cover the European utility sector, so we cover the big European utilities. And the job of an equity analyst is really quite tricky because we are trying to predict the future. And I've been doing it for 16 years, and I reckon about half of my recommendations have been right, about half of my recommendations have been wrong. And therefore, you can throw a dart, the old classic, trying to predict the future makes you look like an idiot. There's probably been about 3 or 4 occasions when, though, it's an absolute banker about what's going to happen. 100%. And as I've just mentioned, as soon as Mr. Middleman sat down, we knew 100% the share prices of Centrica SSE, 2 UK listed stocks, would go down. Now, in the 12 months prior to the speech, both companies are probably pretty much in line with the wider market. SSE had outperformed the FTSE 100 by 5% in that 12 months, Centrica by about 3%. In the 4 months following the speech, they lost 25% of their relative value, which combined is £8 billion of market cap. Now that's just not paper money, that's valuation lost from companies who form a big part of people's pension pots. These are companies which are overwhelmingly held by UK pension funds, and they lost that value. Have they recovered that since? Not really. SSE has recovered about 1/3 of it, Centrica maybe about 15–20% of it. So there's been a permanent diminution in value. Other things have happened. The reason I've chose that 4-month period is that that's the sort of period we can tell that it was the speech. Other things happen, obviously, over time. Other people obviously made money. It wasn't just equity analysts that spotted these stocks were going to go down. The hedge funds piled in like crazy and shorted the stock and probably made around about £300 to £500 million, depending on whose numbers you use of that. So the intervention took £8 billion of valuation of pension funds and handed hundreds of millions of pounds of basically free profit to activist hedge funds, particularly the event-driven hedge funds. It's had other consequences. It's pushed up the cost of capital of the sector. We can see that through the rise in dividend yields. So Centrica's dividend yield has gone from 4.5% to close to 6%. SSE is at 1 point hit 7%. That's in other words the equity market demanding higher returns for the risk of holding these stocks. The increase in cost of capital has been most noticed actually on the debt side. So the rating agencies, I'll use Centrica as the example, has told Centrica to maintain its current rating, A1 or A-, it needs to hold £1 billion of additional capital buffers. So Centrica is selling assets, it's cutting its capex, and it's going to hold that £1 billion to maintain its credit rating. Now that's dead money. That's money that would have otherwise been invested, would have otherwise created jobs, it would have otherwise done something useful, maybe giving it back to shareholders. But to maintain its credit rating, and the credit rating agencies are specific. It is to deal with the increased political risk, and the biggest element of that increased political risk is the threat of the price freeze. So, does a price control equal the end of the market? Well, it definitely doesn't help, does it? I mean, markets are about price discovery at the end of the day.
They happen throughout Europe, so I mean,
Markets are about price discovery. And markets, lots of different players do lots of different things, and out of that you get a sort of, a market price and a profit level. And this is not static, it moves all the time. Clearly, the threat of increasing price controls distorts market behaviour and disrupts or destroys the ability to discover price properly. And we're already seeing it. So, we're already seeing a big distortion of behaviour. So what did SSE do in response to the price freeze? Well, it has gone in and provided a fixed price tariff to its consumers out to 2016. And I know a lot of people, particularly on the Labour side, thought this was a great success. Nonsense. What they've done is gone and fixed into a much higher gas price than the current gas price. And they've needed to do that to protect themselves against the price freeze. Now, as often is the case, just as politicians spot an opportunity or sort of panic, the market actually turns. So since the price freeze was announced, the gas price is down 15%. So if Labour could have legislated the day of the speech, as no doubt they would have done if they were in power, they'd have locked the UK into a 15% higher commodity price than the current commodity price. These policies have lots and lots of unintended consequences, which frankly I don't think any political party has the analytical capacity to understand when they set the policies. Now, I'm not saying, listen, you shouldn't do this stuff, but there are massive consequences for doing it when you play around with markets which are so big and particularly involve commodities. Now, what we've also seen is a big impact on the suppliers, the independent suppliers and the other suppliers. Basically, they've been withdrawing products. So nobody can now offer a product that goes beyond the election, pretty much. I mean, there are some products out there, but suppliers have been withdrawing products because nobody knows what this price freeze is going to look like. Is it a cap? Will it apply to business? Will it apply to just residential? Will it apply to the independents? Will it just apply to the big six? Who knows? So what you're seeing is a drying up of the offerings being made, particularly in the B2B market. Now, why is the price freeze so damaging? Well, this is a commodity business. These companies are dealing with really big numbers. So Centrica, at any one point in time, has about £30 billion of forward energy purchases lined up. So it's already committed, as we speak today, to £30 billion of energy purchases, and it has an annual turnover in its British gas business of about 14 billion a year. Now, if you think about it as a business, if you get those numbers just slightly wrong, you can wipe out a year's profit. If you get it really badly wrong, you can bust yourself very, very easily. And this is not theoretical. It happened to E.ON and RWE. E.ON and RWE in 2009-2010 locked themselves into high gas prices because they indexed themselves to oil. Oil and gas decoupled, RWE and E.ON lost €5 billion over 2 years. And it crippled RWE, nearly bankrupted E.ON. So, the inability to change your price in this type of business and react to the movements in commodity prices is not just a minor problem, it is a life-threatening problem for any corporate. The other problem with the price freeze is it broke the compact, because since 2003, when Europe embarked upon its sort of decarbonisation energy policy, there's been a compact. So basically the industry was asked to invest tens of billions, going to hundreds of billions of pounds, in decarbonising the power sector and the economy. And in return for that, the politicians would ensure that they could earn a reasonable return and the consumer would pay. What Labour have effectively done is said to the industry, we know your costs are rising because of energy policy, but we want you, the industry, to suck those costs for 2 years. And the industry saying, well, hang on, saying, well, it's not our policy. We didn't choose to decarbonise the economy. We're very happy to go along with it, but it's not our policy. You're making us suck those costs for 2 years. So, anyway, it's not been a great policy. There are reasons why we have independent economic regulators, and there are reasons why we have the CMA. It's to stop politically attractive but economically insane policies like this coming to the fore.
Okay, I said we get the debate going again. Politically attractive but economically insane. I better give Caroline a chance to respond to that. I mean, obviously, for a lot of things you were talking about was at the sort of corporate level. I wonder whether you think the customers are still benefiting somehow out of this, although it didn't sound like it from Peter's analysis.
Well, I mean, the idea that, you know, that the energy companies all went out the day after Ed's speech and bought up whatever 4 years supply of energy to offset, I don't think that's quite true. But the other thing, I think, in terms of them, you know, if the suggestion is that they are acting in a cartel-like behaviour to artificially pitch their prices, then that's something they're going to have to answer for as well. And, you know, it's interesting, Peter, about the CMA and the review. The truth is, you know, we wouldn't be having, I don't think, this CMA review unless we had been drawing attention to some of the problems that have been affecting public confidence. But more importantly, it is a market that is just not working. And this is about fixing the market. And the governments, you know, have a responsibility, particularly on something like energy, you know, which I think does require a regulation framework that commands trust but also to make the market work well. It's not competitive enough, it's not transparent enough, and that has been a problem in this area. And the truth is, you know, the public get very frustrated, understandably, when there's any discussion about, you know, the profits or anything like this. You have Ofgem and let's take Labour out of it. You have Ofgem saying one thing, and then the companies all come out and say, no, that's not true, we don't make that much money, all this sort of thing. Part of this is about resetting the market to get it into a better place in which actually we can understand what some of the true cost of energy is. I accept that's not a precise science, but we need to get to a better place than where we are now. And the truth is, I think since about 2009, the profits of these companies have been up about at least £1 billion a year. And in some cases, Centrica, a point in question, their investment profiles before the price freeze actually wasn't that great either. So for the long term, it is actually about providing certainty about the direction of travel for our energy supply, and that is about low carbon. That is what people say to us about investment in the area, is what is Labour's policy for the long term. And in many respects, in terms of the changes to the way the energy market is structured, we've supported the government and shown that there is a consensus in a lot of the areas. On this one we differ, but we think it was important to make a stand on some poor practices that have been going on, but also a market that wasn't competitive enough and certainly wasn't transparent enough.
Okay, I'm just going to come back to Peter for a very brief response. So the argument which we heard there obviously is that the market was broken, it was not transparent, not working. You might not like the price freeze policy, but do you accept that?
Do I accept that? Well, we have an economic regulator, which is Ofgem, and we have a...
The argument is that Ofgem's not doing a good job.
Well, then reform Ofgem. Reform Ofgem, or send this to the CMA. The reason why we've set up these institutions to keep these things at arm's length is a really, really good set of reasons. And for politicians to sort of, ignore that and be the investigator, the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and bypass due process, is a really quite a dangerous thing to do.
We're not bypassing any due process, we're going through a parliamentary process.
Okay, good.
And that's a democratic process.
You both made your point very well. So we'll turn to Simon Moore now, who's the Senior Research Fellow at Pollitt Exchange, looking particularly at energy and environment.
Thank you. I suppose the price freeze is the inevitable conclusion of 10 years of increasing intervention from politicians of all colours in the energy market. We've seen governments over the past decade engaged in a sort of unstoppable drift of more and more regulation, from renewable energy targets through the current energy bill and electricity market reform. With each of these interventions, we've seen politicians taking more decisions and fewer of those decisions being left to the market. The choice of where companies can price their products is the last of those decisions to go. It is slightly difficult to see how the proposal can work. We will see, I think we already have seen to an extent, lobbying beyond that which we've ever seen before to make sure that when government sets the price, as it will have to do, it sets it at a price that is as high as companies can steer it towards. This government decision, whatever the price freeze, price cap is set at, will be the single most important factor for energy companies' success or failure. Yet it's a decision which, to come to a right answer, is impossible. The true future cost of energy, as Peter has explained, is essentially unknowable. So the government will be setting a price that will either be too high and will lead to real profiteering, or will be too low, which will kill off the investment that all parties, again, claim is desperately needed for our energy sector. In other words, it's going to be ripe for gaming.
We're actually going to freeze prices. If the companies actually want to go lower than the freeze, they're perfectly entitled to do that, to get more custom.
So it's a cap?
Yeah, it's a cap.
Okay, not a freeze. Okay.
It's a freeze that, and they can go, yeah, well, okay.
The other challenge will be...
But it's no, that's the optimum.
The other challenge will be to see how the cap ends. If it's had the effect that is claimed of lowering prices below those which the market would have delivered, presumably at the end of it, the market price would still be higher than the frozen price or capped price. Would it be allowed to return under those circumstances? Is that something that would be politically acceptable? In other words, can the price freeze actually be as temporary as it's set? Certainly it can achieve popularity, but whether this can permanently allow prices to become detached or separated from the underlying market forces, well, it's hard to see that working. Clearly, though, there is a perception problem with the energy sector, both from politicians and from the public. Yet I think a lot of the evidence that has been used to support this has been circumstantial at best, certainly not definitive. I'm not saying there isn't a problem, I'm not saying that there is, but it's not yet self-evident that malpractice is occurring. This is a very good reason for having the CMA inquiry, which can get to the bottom of this and pull out the genuine evidence on whether there is a case to answer. But unless there is political backing for the findings of the CMA and for its proposed remedies, it may be that Westminster or public support doesn't improve if the CMA findings are ignored. When we have politicians preempting its findings, we risk both hasty and ineffectual solutions, but also wasting everyone's time with an arduous and costly legal process that turns out to be irrelevant. Independent regulation and effective competition are not a sexy sell in comparison with a price freeze or price cap. But at the moment, the costs of decarbonisation are still substantial. An honest message about the future of energy in this country would say, costs are likely to rise, but we are doing all we can to keep that rise as low as possible, and we will protect the vulnerable while we do that. And there are plenty of other steps that can be taken in order to achieve that. The recent move to auctioning for subsidies is a start in the process of getting competition back into the generation side, but there's plenty of scope to go further to help us get beyond a marketplace where everything gets a subsidy. Shale gas is a big unknown right now, but there is a need to explore, find out what we have on our hands. The impact may not be the same as the US, where prices have halved, but we shouldn't dismiss it in advance of knowing what we've got. It's also important, and I welcome Caroline's announcement on this, to get much more serious about energy efficiency, both for fuel poverty and for climate change reasons. Spend on energy efficiency is a much more cost-effective way of cutting carbon than many other things that we're spending far more on, and I welcome their moves to make that policy work again. Finally, making at the consumer end, making switching easier, quicker, less bureaucratic, and making collective switching more viable is an important step that could be taken. This isn't the same as some of the recent proposals we've had and had implemented to restrict tariff numbers, which have, to the surprise of hardly anyone, seen the cheapest tariffs removed from the market. All of these have potential to make real impacts, but perhaps have less razzle-dazzle than the price freeze that's on offer.
Thanks, Simon. Razzle-dazzle. It was certainly a popular policy. If you looked at the polling around it, was like 75–80% of people liked it. So whether that's a good thing or not, I want to get to you guys in the audience. I'm going to hand straight over to Michael Pollitt, who's the Assistant Director of the Energy Policy Research Group at Cambridge University. And Mike, I just wondered if I could ask you, what's sort of underpinned a lot of the conversation so far is whether or not the market's working. If the market's working, then you wouldn't need, well, you might argue, the policies which Caroline set out. If it isn't working, maybe you would. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on those, as well as everything else.
Yeah, let me come back to that. I came to answer the question, okay? Forgive me if I try and inject some theory and evidence, and I'm pleased that we've had some, and I make no apology for the belief that ignoring theory and evidence is to condemn politicians to make mistakes. So can we think about what the theory of competitive markets is about? It's primarily a process for delivering dynamic benefits to society. And in a typical market in the UK, we expect productivity growth of about 2% a year, and that rapidly accumulates to dynamic benefits, even though in the short run there might be some static benefits to just getting the prices down towards cost. In retail energy, the value of competition, of course, may be non-price, and maybe in terms of the development of better targeted tariffs, higher levels of customer service, attraction of new entrants, diversification of sources of supply, and the better pursuit of energy efficiency and environmental targets, all things which I think you can argue we have seen since privatisation and introduction of competition. And indeed, the biggest benefit of retail competition is the associated encouragement to competition in wholesale markets and the management of wholesale price risk and the downward pressure it puts on wholesale prices. So that's what competition can do. Okay, let's turn to this price freeze proposal for 20 months from May 2015. Well, as a student of global electricity markets, it is pretty difficult to adequately describe the intellectual contempt that one needs to have for a policy like that. You know, either, as we've heard before from Simon, the price cap will be at such a high level that it'll be meaningless, or either it will bind and it will lead to shortages somewhere. Either not necessarily shortages of electricity, but certainly shortages of investment. It is not an economically sensible policy to help hard-pressed consumers. In a country which has probably got the most sophisticated tax and benefit system in the world, this is not what you do to help consumers. And similarly, if you want to tax profits, we've got a very sophisticated profits taxation system as well. This is the energy policy of Venezuela. I mean, it's quite literally the energy policy of Venezuela. I did look up the energy policy, but this, you know, having price caps way below cost, and having energy shortages, and, you know, presidents being cut off on television.
Are you saying that the lights are going to go out there?
No, I'm saying it is the energy policy of Venezuela. And as you know very well, Caroline, the International Energy Agency notes that pricing energy below cost is one of the world's most scandalous policies globally, and cost societies about $500 billion globally. It worsens energy security, it pollutes the environment, it doesn't promote energy efficiency, and it creates energy poverty for those who are denied access to energy. In the UK, we've already heard what it's likely to do. Of course, it won't do what it does in Venezuela, but Venezuela is, you know, the extreme example. It was going to raise the cost of capital, as we've heard from Peter. It's going to promote evasive action by companies. You know, we're certainly recommending to the companies that we talk about, well, just sell your retail business, because you'll be in the nicely protected wholesale business, if you can find anybody to buy your retail business, of course. And just put all your customers on expensive long-term contracts, which we've already heard is happening. All these effects are entirely predictable, theoretically, and they're exactly what's been happening. So one can only hope that the Competition and Markets Authority will correctly use economic theory of energy markets and independent evidence to propose solutions which actually promote dynamic benefits of competition to consumers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. I mean, can I just ask the question I just sort of chucked in at the beginning? Because you know, Caroline's taken a lot of flack here in very colourful ways, which is good for the event. But I kind of wonder whether you, to me it seems at least, and I confess to being economically illiterate, so you can be contemptuous towards me, that's absolutely fine. Do you think the market's working? Because if the market's not working, you should do something. Because a lot of the criticism seems to be based on the premise that the market works.
Okay, well, I think the analysis is now in. Okay, the analysis was that there was not a problem in 2008, but systematic interventions inspired by political concern, but promoted by an independent regulator, have systematically acted to raise prices above what they would otherwise have been and have increased retail margins. So there wasn't a problem with the competitive market before the government and the regulator started messing about with it. And there's plenty of analysis which shows that is exactly what's happened.
So just to be clear on that, it's not that prices, I'll come to you in a second, Caroline, it's not that prices have gone up just to cover the cost of going low carbon. You're saying the profits have gone up because of...
There's some evidence that the margins have increased a little bit, but that is because of a lack of competition, because of government intervention to restrict the number of tariffs, and to restrict competition.
Okay, finally, and the last thing, this thing people call vertical integration, so wholesalers owning retail businesses, you think that's fine? The market can operate with those companies having that vertical integration?
I think there are a lot of benefits to vertical integration, and the market should decide, a competitive market should decide what the optimal degree of vertical integration is.
Okay, right, so well, Karen's taken a lot of barbs there, so I'll give her a chance to reply. Economics of, or the energy policy of Venezuela.
I mean, I just thought it's just interesting in terms of, you know, how, you know, the market can sort these problems out, the market can deliver low carbon, we just leave them on. I just don't think it works like that. I mean, even, you know, I've been at, even in CBI, at events where they've said, you know, actually energy does need to be a managed market. And it's so interesting as well how, you know, in other areas of policy on energy, I mean, you know, we're being asked, politicians, you know, not just the Labour Party, to underwrite the costs through contracts for differences. You know, I mean, in that sense, you know, there's never been more of a relationship between, you know, helping to set the price of what people can expect to therefore help with the lowering the risks of capital investment in these new areas. Now, you know, 20 odd years ago, certainly, well, even in 97 for that matter, but even before that, privatisation, the issues of climate change just weren't really on the agenda in the way they have been in the last few years. So that was something, you know, when, you know, regulator was established, when obviously privatisation and everything else, and even some of the early interventions from the Labour government in 97 didn't really factor anything of that in. I hope it's the case, maybe I'm wrong about that, but certainly when I talk to our big energy companies and others, I don't get a pushback from them saying we don't want to do anything about being low carbon, because obviously a lot of them have got business parts of their generation side that are heavily involved in that area. So look, we're on that path. I agree with comments made about how we set the direction of travel, and that's why it's been important for us to lay out our views around trying to decarbonise the electricity supply and so on. But I have to say, you know, if the market was working so well, you know, why is it some of the problems that have become more and more public about how customers are treated weren't dealt with by the companies in question? But also, when we look at the total cost of the bill, yes, I take the point that government asks have added something to the bill, whether it's for insulation or for supporting renewables. But that doesn't begin to equate with the size of the bill, and where we've looked at where wholesale costs have fallen, the data suggesting that haven't been passed on to the customers. And, you know, look, we're very clear that we do think, actually, we're not asking companies to divest themselves of their generation and retail side, but we want a firewall that everyone can sign up to. Now, some of the big six already tell me they have that. And what I've said to them is, well, tell us how you do that there is this firewall, because what we want is a consistency across the sector, so nobody can feel that there is any gaming going on by those who both generate energy and sell it to themselves almost before they sell it on to us. On the pool, again, I think that's something that there's been considerable interest in, particularly from small suppliers and independent generators, and is something, there are the good examples elsewhere. And we do think the problem with the regulator is, the regulator that we've got today Ofgem was, as you will well know, was a sort of splicing together of the gas regulator and electricity. It was developed in a time of post-privatisation. We're in a different world now in terms of the challenges and what is expected, and that's why, you know, it needs to be recast and reset to allow them to make the choices, not politicians intervening all the time, but for an energy sector that is rapidly changing to the needs of today, which are very different to what was thought about when they were privatised so many years ago.
Okay, I'm just going to put one last point here and then come to the audience, so start thinking of your good questions. One of the criticisms Michael made there was that you might end up setting the price below cost. which would be damaging to the companies in a fairly obvious fashion. Is that a risk, you think, from the policies you set out, that you could end up freezing the price below cost?
Look, we've, as I said, looked at what we felt was happening in the market in terms of where wholesale costs weren't passed on, but also what we've seen in different years in terms of both the profit margins, but also how there have been unexpected windfalls in terms of certain years. I know, but when we had the very harsh winter in 2010, just to give an example of something of a different approach to this, in 2010 it was a very severe winter. Obviously people had their heating on a lot, and as a result you saw the profits go up. Now, one of the Irish energy companies went through the same situation, and they said to themselves, do you know what, we obviously want to make some profit, but we didn't realise we'd make that much profit, so they gave a rebate back to their customers based on those circumstances, act of God, whatever you want to call it, climate change, that created that cold winter. So we have had to try to look at what is the situation overall in terms of how these companies finance themselves, pay for their costs, but also the profits on top. And we think, therefore, you know, that's part of our thing about a price freeze. Can I just say something else about the end of it? You know, one of the things about this debate is about the companies looking at themselves and saying, how hard do they want to fight for customers? You know, so they'll have 20 months to think about that as well, in terms of what their offer is going to be post the price freeze too.
Okay, Peter, you want to make a quick point?
Yeah, just two very small points. I mean, Caroline's outlined a whole series of sort of issues and problems and challenges faced by this industry, by the sector, and I don't disagree with a single one of those things. Just the problem is not a single one of those things is helped by a price freeze, and in fact, actually, you make most of those problems worse. And also, just to be clear, you cannot regulate prices in this industry. This is an industry based on international commodity markets. You cannot regulate prices. What you're regulating is margins, profits, losses and pluses. You cannot regulate prices. It's impossible. Can't be done.
But there are, I mean, there's over half the countries in the European Union that have price controls, don't they?
They have controlled tariffs, but the costs are ultimately feed through. I mean, there's no... You know,
but they do have permanent price controls, don't they, in one form or another?
But why are you proposing a price cap, a margin cap, where you're going to pass on a markup on top of the wholesale price? That would, you know, that's what we had before we removed price controls for retail energy. Why is it a silly price freeze rather than some sort of cap on the margin in the supply business, which would have been the obvious regulatory measure to implement?
Which is what?
Let Caroline answer that.
Look, we felt that it's important to give, first of all, people some certainty about the, you know, for certainty in terms of those 20 months about where their energy prices are going to go. And the truth is, people have seen a situation where, and just on the switching thing, look, I'm all in favour of switching, but the truth is, for a whole host of reasons, more than we've got time to talk about today, people don't do it. And that's why it's not enough to have a switching policy without actually having a way in which companies, even if you stay with a company, they are working in a proper way towards you as a customer. Our view was that a price freeze was a simpler way of actually saying you'll have certainty about the cost of your energy for those 20 months, and with that, you know, you can get something in terms of an assurance that your costs are going to be fixed, and therefore you can plan for that. And it was a way of giving something back to people in terms of not receiving any benefits from wholesale cost reductions before. There are other things we will be doing to support people through other programmes to tackle low-income and fuel-poor households during that period as well. But that was the simplest way. And there was a debate, you know, John Major, I think, at the time said, why don't you just have another windfall levy on the whole thing? To be honest, that would have involved an administration and then a target and all this. This was a way to do something really relatively simple in terms of all the customer bases across these companies.
Okay, great. We should come to the audience now. So I'm going to take questions two at a time. And if you can say who you are and keep it relatively brief so everyone's got a chance to do it. So the gentleman at the back will be first, you with the red tie, and then this lady with the pink jumper.
Thanks. Cameron Penny from Cicero. I'm interested to know, Caroline, why you just dismiss switching completely out of hand, because surely that's you said basically there were too many reasons why we couldn't go into it now. I think that's actually a good time is to go into it now, because it's an instant thing people can do, is it not, to actually change their tariff to get a saving, and it doesn't involve sort of really interventionist measures that the Labour Party has proposed. I'm just wondering why you've just glossed over that completely.
Okay.
We've only got an hour.
Don't worry, we'll come to that in a sec. The lady in the pink jumper here.
Laura Cohen, British Ceramic Confederation. I just wanted to, we have about 100 different companies in our membership making anything from bricks to tableware to high-tech ceramics. As large industrial users, we can be the first off the system, particularly for gas and possibly electricity, when supplies run short. The announcement, and as we explained in our response to Powering Britain, has heightened fears that there will be more concerns around shortages at a time when we need to be attracting more investment in manufacturing processes as the economy recovers. What can you say, Caroline, to help assure us that security concerns will be addressed, because we need to help these investments, businesses and jobs?
But Caroline, let me come to you in a second, because I just want to give Simon, maybe, do you think, in fact, yeah, any of the other panellists, and then we'll come to Caroline after, but I wondered, can switching play a really big part in bringing people's bills down? That's part of the first question, and the second one, is this price freeze endangering the security of supply, which would affect Laura's members there?
I mean, just very briefly on the switching, I think we saw in the sort of 3-4 months after the announcement of last year's conference, a big jump in switching rates to some of the non-big 6 suppliers. That said, I agree with Caroline that there are some problems with the operation of how switching works. It takes an incredibly long time for something that should be very straightforward, and making that more sort of accessible for consumers, making it much less of a hassle, making it much less of something that they feel this is going to be a massive time sink is going to be important. But there are also the issues that Michael raised, where both with the Ofgem regulations from the last year and also from some of the earlier ones, which have reduced the price differentials in the market and reduced the kind of incentive for people to change.
Thanks, Simon. Peter, maybe you take the other question, which is, I mean, do you think security of supply is an issue now that this policy is, within 8 months if Caroline's party wins the election?
Well, security of supply is an issue. We have an odd situation actually where we've got a lot of generation capacity on the system relative to demand for normal times, and then we've got very low spark spread. So actually, gas-fired power stations in the country are losing money at the moment.
What's the spark spread?
The spark spread is the margin you can make by running a gas-fired power station. Right. So we actually have a third of the power station fleet loss-making at the moment, and yet we actually run the risk of running out of power in the middle of the winter when we need it. And the problem is that we have a sort of we have a decarbonisation strategy that has sort of 2 strands to it. One is a sort of closure programme, which government wants things to shut, which they don't like: coal, oil, and then eventually gas, and they want to replace with low carbon. Unfortunately, at the moment, the closure programme is running to time, and the new build programme is running 4 years late. Hence we have a bit of a mismatch.
We all understand that. Michael, do you want to have a go at either of those?
Well, just on the shortages issue, I mean, obviously what it will do is, if it's binding, it will increase the demand from the customers who are getting lower prices than they would otherwise have been. But that's not necessarily the biggest sort of intra-season or intraday problem. I think the biggest problem is that a price freeze amounts to, as Dieter Helm has said, a profits tax of unknown magnitude. So obviously it could end up being a very high profits tax, and of course that will raise the cost of capital. It will reduce investment in generation, and so of course the shortage problems won't necessarily show up during the price freeze. They'll show up 2 years later.
Okay, good. So Caroline, you told me you weren't glossing over price at switching.
Sorry.
What are you doing
Yeah,
to try and what you're proposing?
Sorry, I didn't get your name, but Mr. Cicero back there. Look, I'm not against switching. In fact, not last year, but the year before, I actually announced that the Labour Party was the first political party to actually take part in a collective switch, in which we, through our membership and everything, we encourage that to happen, and we work with Labour colleagues in councils around the country, and there's some really great work going on. Don't get me wrong, my own council, Doncaster, is supporting that as well, and in other parts of Europe and in America, collective switching, not just for energy but car insurance and all sorts of things, is pretty strong actually in some communities. But the nature of this market and the custom base, apart from the fact sometimes even when you're trying to switch, as has been said, it's really difficult, but also quite a lot of the price comparison sites are paid money from some of the companies involved, so it's quite difficult for people to work out whether they've got an honest broker they're dealing with. But we've also found even sometimes where people have switched thinking they were going to get a good deal, it hasn't quite worked out in the way they thought. And you know, that's not me just saying that. There's evidence of that people ended up sometimes being on a worse tariff when they worked out all the detail in it than they were before. So we're not against that, but it still seems to me that whether you're a large company or a small company, what customers should be assured of is that there are going to be certain rules in place to prevent you being exploited. And by that I mean, for example, we've seen some moves in terms of companies holding on to people's money where they've paid over their direct debit and literally sitting on hundreds of pounds of a person's cash and gaining from that instead of sending it back to the customer. We've seen some problems, I have to say, in terms of some of the switching, in terms of the amount of time when you go from one company to another, but also then the original company holding again onto your money, trying to come to agreement about how much you owe before. There are a lot of things here. So it's not against switching. You know, I'm not against switching. But actually we're still going to make sure that for those people who stick with the company, that there are certain rules and expectations of how you're treated as a customer that you can be assured of.
Okay,
security, I just maybe just say
Reassure
something
Laura.
about that. It is a really big issue, and what frustrates me, to be honest, is that you know, when sometimes you have one of the organisations, say Ofgem, saying one thing, the outgoing chief executive of Ofgem, just before he went, he said, "Oh, it's all really awful. I wonder what you've been doing for so many years that you wait until he left to say all this." And then you have, you know, National Grid saying, "Well, actually, you know, the sort of the margins we're dealing with, you know, are not actually that much worse than say back in 2008, and we can manage it in these different ways." So you get these, and of course, when anyone says anything about, you know, security, it's going to be headlines in newspapers because it will be lights out and all this sort of thing. We really need, I think, to get to a better place where, you know, there is some consensus about what the real risks are. And I'm not saying politicians should do that, but that we can all work with. Because there will be ebbs and flows on all of this. The capacity mechanism is a really important part of this, and I've raised questions with Ed Davey about, you know, what they're going to do in terms of bringing online. I'd like to say that most of the gas-fired power stations that have come online started under the last Labour government, but one of our proposals in the Green Paper was to establish, it's a working title, a sort of energy security board, because along with you know, the regulator and the Committee on Climate Change, we felt there was an important, if you like, voice in this missing, which is keeping us all on our toes about the security needs as well, and about the interaction of these other policies. And I think there is a big debate to be had about how much is indigenous in terms of our security, but how much we might think through European interconnectors as well. But it is an important issue, and we think it should have a much more central focus in terms of our decisions.
Great, let's get some more questions. So, gentleman here, glasses, and the lady, the red jacket afterwards.
Lewis Siri from Brunswick. I just want to know, do you think there are any countries in the world who are good examples of, you know, a fair and socially just energy market? What particular things do they do? What particular policies or features do they have that we could look to as a blueprint going forward?
Good question. And lady with the red jacket at the back.
Thank you, Helmut Day, John Muir Trust. I was interested in the Energy Security Board that Carolyn just mentioned, and it ties in really with something we think is required, it's National Energy Commission with enough independent experts on it to look at the wider range of energy issues, because I think one of the problems maybe with the price freeze, like many of the initiatives on energy we've seen over the last couple of decades, is they tend to be about there's a problem in front of us, what's the solution to that bit of the problem, and they're not looking at the rest of it. So renewables obligation was brought in to bring something to market. That's not what it's here for now, and we don't revisit that. And so along with the National Infrastructure Commission that you're looking at, we'd like you to look at that as a wider issue. Thanks.
Right, okay, thanks for both of those. Michael, can I ask you, I mean, you're academic, sure, you look at lots of different things, and I mean, it seems to me, and again, I sort of confess to being economically illiterate. In fact, Caroline, quite earlier, I switched and got a higher bill, so that's how smart I am. I mean, Britain seems to be kind of, on the scale of it, relatively deregulated as an energy market. Are there other places you think are doing a good job?
I think that you know, there's legitimate public concern in energy prices, and I think if you ask what's a sensible energy policy towards prices, there are certain states in the United States that have introduced a sort of default tariff which people are put on if they want to be on it. And that price, of course, is not a frozen price tariff. It is it's a tariff where the price moves in line with wholesale prices, but the margin is fixed, which would have been a much more sensible policy than one that's being proposed. So clearly, if you do want to do that, that is a matter for public debate. Of course, you do learn the cost of that is you do lose the advantages of competition in generation, where you're mixing generation and supply. So yes, there are certain states in the United States, like Ohio, where these sorts of default tariffs do exist and seem to work quite well. But of course, there are also states in the United States which are incredibly competitive and have competitive, at least as competitive retail energy markets as we do, like Texas, which seem to function very well as well. So, you know.
Okay. Can I also ask you, given that I'll come to you in a second, Caroline, as an academic, this idea of an energy security board, I mean, the Climate Change Committee seems, I would think most people would agree, does a good job in trying to produce, you know, a kind of independent analysis of the situation. Do you think there should be space for that in this, you know, very contested and controversial area of energy?
Well, I'm deeply suspicious of it because
you're not going to be on it then,
because whenever, I mean, Caroline mentioned this, you know, she's talked about a managed energy market. Well, the question is,
the CBI talked about that actually.
Yeah, but you know, the idea of managed energy markets, of course, works very well for incumbents and people who get subsidies. The problem with a strategic energy board will be, it will be the object of huge amounts of lobbying, all of which will drive costs up, because it will all be about, you know, we need more security. Once you let the energy security genie out of the bottle, then, you know, the sky's the limit for energy expenditure. Whereas, you know, the best thing for energy security is to be part of a globally integrated energy market, or a European-wide integrated energy market, because that provides lots of security and competition at the same time.
Caroline?
Yeah, okay. So, any other countries? So
not Venezuela.
When we were looking at, I mean, it is quite. I don't think there's a sort of like, you know, one country where you pick everything off the shelf and all of that. But certainly when we were looking at the idea of a sort of electricity pool, we did look to the Nord Pool and we looked at some of the power exchanges in the United States. Interesting thing from what I understand about the Nord Pool is that actually the politicians were moving that they wanted to go towards this, but actually what ended up happening was the companies involved volunteered to do it themselves, from what I understand. So I think that's quite an interesting, if you like, sort of where politics says, look, we think we need to do something about this, we want some transparency and openness, and actually some of the sectors respond to that and say, do you know what, we're going to move and get this because otherwise they're going to do it. Now, that hasn't happened in our area, but we think that's quite interesting. And the power exchanges in America too. On regulation again, we've been quite interested in some of the regulatory environments in America, which I think in many respects have been, in some cases, a lot tougher on consumer interests and concerns than they have been here. And so that has been one of the point of contexts that we've been looking at there as well. But as I said, I don't think there's like something you can just take off the shelf from anywhere else. But I think there certainly it's been interesting just looking at the flavour of what other countries have tried to address similar problems with.
Great, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to squeeze in two more questions, then we'll give you guys a chance. So I think you had your hand up, and gentleman over there.
Hi there, Metin Pollitt, calling Labour Party. I wanted to ask about the CMA's pushback on Tim Yo's request to investigate the wholesale gas markets, and if you think it's fit for purpose without going into that key area. And just quickly, I found Peter's analysis very interesting, but at the same time, governing according to the short termism of the markets, I find very undemocratic and quite depressing as well.
Okay, we'll give Peter a chance to answer that, and then the other gentleman over there.
Matthew Beach from Utility Week. Two questions. First one's quite quick and simple. How would the price freeze stand up to a potential coalition? So the Lib Dems, would it be non-negotiable?
They'd fall in behind it if it ever got that far.
And secondly, we've heard of the impacts that the price freeze could have on investment. Is this you putting affordability above everything else in the trilemma?
Okay, thanks for those. I will come to Peter first, actually. I think the question was partly about whether the CMA should also be looking at the wholesale gas market, is that right? Yeah. But then also the suggestion your analysis was a short-term one rather than a sort of longer-term one?
Sure. On the first question, I don't really have a view. I mean, the CMA, are a very, very good body, employing a lot of very smart people, and if they think they need to look at something, they will. If they don't, they don't. And I don't have the data to sort of second guess them. On the sort of short term, I mean, of course you shouldn't run. Equity analysts shouldn't tell politicians what to do. However, what I can point out is the consequences of what you've done. And I would ask a question, any particular policy is always about a cost benefit at the end of the day. Did the people in Mr. Miliband's team, before they announced it, thinking through this announcement, did they realise that they would be handing hundreds of millions of pounds of very easy money to hedge funds? Did they realise that it would take £8 billion off UK pensions? Did they realise they'd increase the cost of capital very, very substantially and reduce investment and hit jobs, etc., etc.? And did they put that properly on the negative column when they thought about the benefits that would flow from this announcement?
Okay, I take it from that you think the cost benefit is definitely on the cost as opposed to the benefit, whether it's short term or long term that you're looking at.
On this particular policy? Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, Simon, I mean, you can take the question about the sort of long term or short term, or also whether a price freeze would work under a coalition.
I cannot speak for any of the members of the potential coalition on that part of the question. In terms of the potential reordering of the items in the trilemma, it's interesting that it's taken this long to get this far. In some senses, the sort of the dominance that I think the decarbonisation agenda, for want of a better term, had at the back end of the last decade seems to have waned somewhat, and the consumer sort of value for money interests are becoming more prominent. I do think that it's possible to balance these things, but I think that the balance that we're seeing with more attention on the impacts of low carbon policy on bills is an important one, and one that I hope that should Caroline find herself in Whitehall, one she will continue.
Sure. All right, Michael, I'll leave you off the political question as well, because we have a politician here to answer that one. But I mean, do you think the price side of the trilemma, as opposed to carbon and security, has been overemphasised by the Labour policies that we've been discussing today?
Well, I think, I mean, in a sense, it's up to the political system to determine what the relative weight of the elements of the trilemma are. I think what I would always say is, look, define clearly what it is you're trying to achieve with your policy, and then you can get some decent advice as to what the best policy might be. It's not clear that this price freeze is the best solution to the problem that was identified, and it's not clear what the problem actually was. If the problem is you just want to help poor energy customers, clearly a general price freeze is not the best targeted way to do that, has lots of unintended consequences.
Okay, Caroline, I'll give you the last word.
Okay. Look, I think people want to feel they're paying a fair price, and I've been very careful about not sort of suggesting that this is some sort of thing about it's cheaper prices or what have you. It's about a fair price, and the win in all of this ultimately is for there to be that confidence that the way in which the energy market works is that we can be assured that it can be as transparent as possible, that actually there is competitive downward pressure on costs, and the companies are running in an efficient way within the things that they have control of to make sure that there is a good balance between what they're expecting their customers to pay against what their investment should be, and then of course obviously their profits and supporting their shareholders and investors in that. So the big gain of all this is about getting to a better place in terms of what is fair. And I do think affordability is an important part of what we have to address, because we are asking, the British public to basically, underwrite a huge change in the way we need to source our energy going forward. And I know we talk about the cost of low carbon, but there is a cost to not going low carbon in terms of what we rely on in the future and what the future offers in terms of jobs and growth. And that is why, ever since I've had this job, of course it's about climate change and low carbon, but it's also about making the case that we can do that in a way that is helpful to our economy and do it in a fair way in terms of bills, but also security as well. And these things do all come together. And I think that is a good way to try and find a a connection between, you know, businesses and families and everyone else about what this means to them. And, you know, and I think, as I say, is to get to a better place in all of this. As far as, just to say something on the wholesale gas markets, I mean, it is a different sort of beast in terms of electricity. And I mean, in our green paper, we did ask and got some feedback on, you know, what ideas there were to try and bring some more transparency into that sector as well. And we haven't come to a definitive answer on that, but I think actually that area would also benefit from something to reassure people how that works. Now, I presume the reason why the CMA turned down Timio, I don't know, it's probably they've got enough to deal with in terms of the remit they'd already set themselves. But, you know, I also have to say, you know, I feel that the fact that so many of the areas the CMA have chosen to look at, and the fact it echoes some of the questions we've been asking that need to be discussed and answered, shows that we actually were pushing in the right direction on a number of the different fronts. Coalition, well, let's see what happens. I'm sure there's going to be, as the clock, you know, the countdown starts, there'll be, you know, it'll be like, depending how sad you are, countless dinner parties that people will be saying, well, what do you think will happen if Labour gets this amount? What policies will they be prepared to share? Who will they snuggle up with, and all this sort of thing? What I am absolutely certain is if we hope to win outright, and this is one of our red lines going forward, we will have the price freeze, we will look to reform the market, but also, importantly, in terms of, you know, what people want in the sector, in terms of getting the investment in. And I, you know, recently met people in terms of what's happening in nuclear, and there's some really interesting developments there that are actually, I mean, some people may not agree with nuclear in the audience here. Labour has decided back to nuclear. Actually, there's some really hopeful stuff about more investment in that area coming forward, and what they want is certainty about the general consensus on the framework, but also about where the direction of travel is, about where we want to source our energy for the future. And for our purposes, that's low carbon.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much to all the panellists. Who knows, in 12 months' time we might be sat here in a world of frozen prices, and we can hear from all the other panellists about what the result of that is. So thank you very much to Caroline, thank you to Michael, to Peter and to Simon and Policy Exchange, and to all of you. Okay, thank you.